Hello and welcome. You've found the Social Work Podcast. My name's Jonathan Singer, and I'll be your host as we explore all things social work. Schizophrenia continues to be one of the most publicly misunderstood and stigmatized of all mental illnesses. For much of the 20th century, neither psychotherapy nor medication provided much relief for people with this serious and persistent mental illness. Psychotherapists blamed the mother and ultimately the family for causing schizophrenia. Medication reduced psychotic symptoms without increasing the person's ability to function. Because there were no effective treatments, people with schizophrenia were first institutionalized, and then during the deinstitutionalization movement, they were released to communities who were unprepared to treat them. It was during this period that two social workers, Jerry Hogarty and Carol Anderson, developed what would become the first empirically validated family therapy for people with schizophrenia. In their 1986 manual on family psychoeducation, Carol and her colleagues described the climate in which they developed their treatment. Here's Carol reading a brief quote.
"We have blamed each other, the patients themselves, their parents and grandparents, public authorities, and society for the cause and for the terrible course of these mental disorders. When hope and money become exhausted, we frequently tear schizophrenic patients from their families, consigning them to the existential terror of human warehouses, single-room occupancy hotels, and more recently to the streets and alleys of American cities."
Even though this quote describes the policies and attitudes of America 30 years ago, the prevalence rates for disorders such as schizophrenia have not decreased, and there continues to be a significant need for effective treatments. In today's podcast, I speak with Carol Anderson about family psychoeducation. According to the American Psychiatric Association, when people with schizophrenia are involved in family psychoeducation while taking medication, there's a significant reduction in relapse and unemployment. Family psychoeducation is only one of a handful of treatments that's been empirically validated to improve the lives of people with serious mental illness. In today's podcast, Carol describes the 5 stages of psychoeducation. She distinguishes between psychoeducation and other forms of family therapy, provides some anecdotes about family psychoeducation treatment, and along the way mentions a number of resources for people who are interested in learning more about how to do family psychoeducation. And now, on to the interview with Carol Anderson about family psychoeducation. Well, Carol, thanks so much for being here today and talking about family psychoeducation. First question, what is family psychoeducation?
Family psychoeducation is a research-based model that provides information to families about the illness and how to manage it in the context of a connected, careful relationship and a follow-up on how to implement the principles that people have been told about. Now, that's my definition. There are a lot of people who might disagree because it's come to mean a lot of different things to different people, but that's, I think, the essence of it.
So what are some of the other things that psychoeducation or family psychoeducation has come to mean?
Well, some people think that if you just provide information to a family or patient, that's psychoeducation. That's information, and that's important to provide information. I think it really helps people to connect, and if they understand a little bit about what they're dealing with and all. But that's a limited view of what can be accomplished through doing a much more detailed involvement with the family.
So you're saying that if I have a family come to see me and it's the first session and I provide them some information about ADHD or schizophrenia or some other mental illness, that's not psychoeducation. That's providing information about a disorder.
I would say that, and I would say that's a good idea and good treatment, but you need to know what people are coping with before you provide them with the information, in my view, because you want to set up a situation where they can hear what you have to say. And if they don't understand that you know what it's all about, they aren't going to listen in the same way, and they aren't going to be able to accept some of the ideas because they've been struggling with probably a problem for a long time, and they think they know more than you do about it in some ways. So you want to set it up so that you can tell them, this is what you've probably been dealing with, and this is why. So it's a really important component of explaining illnesses, and that's part of the research base. Psychoeducation was created based on research that told us about this particular mental illness. In our case, it was schizophrenia. And the normal, natural things patients and families try to do to cope with schizophrenia are not the helpful things. And so we're not saying that the family is disturbed, but we're saying that what you and I would naturally do to try to help someone with a mental illness is not what they need.
That's really interesting. So what were some of the things that family members were doing with good intentions that were actually not being helpful?
Well, initially, when you begin to see symptoms develop, you might try to convince someone it's not true. If someone's having hallucinations or delusions, that's really not true. People are not trying to get you, or people are not talking to you through your teeth, and some of the strange ideas that sometimes mentally ill people have. Or they might try to rally around the patient and spend a lot of time and care with them. And these are patients who are vulnerable to stimulation, so that, in fact, could make things more difficult for them. So there are all kinds of natural responses that people have to illness, and you would do that with a physical illness. You try to be there with them and try to help them all the time. And patients with schizophrenia, for instance, need time away, need not to be having people close in on them. When we found out some of that research, that led us to develop the model in a way that provided respite for both the patient and for the family in terms of intensity.
So when you say it's research-based, you're saying that you discovered some things about the way families interacted with family members who had schizophrenia, and you found that some of these weren't helpful, and then you were able to find out what things were helpful.
Well, actually, we based it on a lot of other people's research when we started. Later, we could say some things about our own. It's been clear for quite a few years with various research projects that patients probably have some basic biological vulnerability to stress, but then stress is a problem in exacerbating that vulnerability. And so the kind of models that had been done up until that time, treatment models and family models, were too intense. So that's part of the research base that I'm talking about. The Brown, Burley, and Wing work out of England, when they found that expressed emotion was difficult for patients in prompted relapse. It made so much sense when you understood that to try to do it differently.
And what you're talking about is the diathesis stress model.
Right.
Okay.
Right. Some people call it the stress diathesis model. Some people call it the stress vulnerability model. But that's basically the theory on which this all is based.
You've been talking about when we developed this model. Who's the we, and how did family psychoeducation develop?
Well, it developed in about 1978. I think we got the grant to do it. Jerry Hogarty, who was a long-term psychotherapy of schizophrenia researcher and other interventions, medication interventions and all, came to me with the article by Brown, Burley, and Wing and knew I was interested in families. And he said, I'd like to do a comparative study of individual treatment for schizophrenia and a family model. And if you could create for me a family model based on this information, we could really do a terrific project. Actually, he told me I could be the queen mother of schizophrenia. And I read the article and I got really excited because I had pretty much decided that family therapy for schizophrenia was not a good idea because it tended to make people feel worse. So we developed, I mainly developed the model, and then Jerry did all the research on it. And we did it for about 8 years and had some really good results that those people who got family psychoeducation did better than those that got individual treatment. And if they got both social skills training for the patient and family treatment, we virtually had almost no relapses in a long period of time, which was very new at that time.
That's remarkable. And just for our listeners who might not know what a relapse is, could you define what relapse means in this context?
Sure. It meant an acute exacerbation of the illness and a readmission to a hospital. So you would have people have an acute illness. We usually picked them up. The research picked them up during an acute episode. Some of them were people who had their first episode. Some of them had been ill for 25 years. They would be randomly assigned to family psychoeducation, social skills training, both, or just medication maintenance. All of them got medication, and that's the group we compared over time.
This is an approach to treatment that involves the family, and it also involves medication,
yes,
which I know can be a little bit controversial for some family therapists to say, let's medicate one person in a system because then we're picking out one person in a system as opposed to addressing the whole system.
This was extremely controversial to family therapists when it started in the late 70s. And in fact, some of my colleagues accused me of selling out to the medical model. But to look at the family as the only potential cause of distress, which was what a lot of the family models were based on in those days, is rather simplistic. I mean, there are family factors that can help, and there are family factors that can exacerbate problems. Mm-hmm. And the notion that there was a biological vulnerability was controversial, but it makes so much sense. I mean, we know with any illness it causes a stress on the family, and the illness may be totally physical, and still it would require a different kind of intervention. So it was a problem, and I think it might still be a problem in some family models, in some family therapists who have not been trained and who have not seen. You know, there are PET scans that show that the brains of these patients are different, and that there's plenty of evidence that they have vulnerabilities that run in families, et cetera. Of course, there could be other explanations for that too, I'm sure. But I think that it's really important to not close our minds to various things that influences the lives of patients, whether they be the kinds of things we do to them, not just the family does to them, but treatment settings that are very intense are difficult for these patients.
Carol, you said that Jerry Hogarty gave you an article and said, if you can develop a model out of this, then we can get this great project going. How did you develop family psychoeducation out of this article?
Well, to be perfectly honest, it wasn't just out of the article. I mean, I had been a family therapist for about 20 years, so I knew family models, and I knew that there were things that fit with that article. What the article told me was that high intensity was not good for these people with this disorder. What that told me is, okay, well, let's try a structural intervention. And it is highly structural, our view of psychoeducation.
And when you say structural, what do you mean?
Structural family therapy, focusing on the importance of boundaries, generational boundaries, interpersonal boundaries, and how those influence, the functioning of the family. I also had a long experience dealing with families and hearing their stories about what they had been coping with and how hard it was for them. So I was very sympathetic to what they had been managing over time. And I had this belief that they needed to know that. They needed to know that I understood how difficult it was before I gave any advice about this structure business and, decreasing intensity. Or else they were going to say, you just don't understand. So the model turned into 4, well, actually in the end 5 phases. The first phase was connecting, and during the connecting phase, we spent a lot of time listening to what they'd been through, talking about how we knew other people had been through this, how hard it was, what are the things they've probably tried and haven't worked, et cetera, that kind of thing of the connecting phase. The second phase was the most exciting phase, and that was the survival skills workshop. And that was a day-long workshop that we spent with, could be anywhere from 3 to 6 families, telling them everything that we knew. And we would talk about, the symptoms of the illness, the potential causes of the illness, what happens to people when they get the illness, what's medication all about, what goes on in the brain, what's the public experience of schizophrenia. In other words, what do they see when they see these symptoms? What's going on inside the patient when that happens, how the patient's feeling and thinking. Then that was pretty much the morning, and then we spent the afternoon telling them how you manage that and what was that going to do for them. And I have to say, I've been in this field now for, I hesitate to say, 40-some years. It always was the most exciting thing that I ever did with patients, because families would come in and they would be skeptical and concerned and thinking, what am I doing here? You probably are going to blame me, because most of the families at that time were blamed for the mental illness. And, I'm not interested in this. And by the end of the day, they were transformed. My God, they had so much more understanding for the patient, of saying, I can just now see, I've been so angry at him because he couldn't get a hold of himself, and now I can see what he must have been going through, or what she must have been going through. Or, now I can understand. I've never encouraged them to stay on their medication because they always looked kind of like zombies. Sometimes they were over-medicated. And now I can see that, when you tell me that the medication stays in his system for 3 months after he's gone off of it, I never connected the relapse with stopping the medication. But now I can see that, in fact, yes, he did relapse 3 months later. And isn't that something? So we set up situations where we would work together against the illness and for the patient.
And so...
Oh, and I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
After that, though, because a lot of people stop there, and I think that's not enough.
You mean they stop after the second
After
phase?
the workshop.
After the workshop, okay.
So, and then there are a couple more phases. The next phase is what we called reentry, because they would leave the hospital, or if they hadn't been in the hospital, we'd try to apply the principles that we had taught them in the workshop to how they're going to survive in everyday life.
Now, let me just ask a quick question. So
okay.
The first phase, is this with the person with schizophrenia? And the second phase is with the family without the person? Or is everybody together all at the same time?
Good question. In our model, the first phase was without the patient. And that was not because the patient didn't have a right to hear or be involved in that. But when we picked them up, the patient was acutely psychotic and wouldn't have been able to tolerate sitting and discussing this. And we also thought the family needed to let off a little steam about what they'd been going through. So we would try to connect with the patient, but we would do that separately. So there would be separate sessions with the patient and with the family, and we would concentrate on the family's needs at that time. The workshop, and we tried to do that early on too, so we didn't think it would be too good to have the patient there, because the workshop lasts about 6-8 hours, depending on the group of families and what they had to say. So the patient wasn't involved in that, and the patient was given that information separately in much smaller doses.
And it sounds like one of the reasons is because typically it's the patient was being stabilized. And prior to that,
right.
They would have had a very hard time with all the stimuli and all the information, the intensity
right.
of those first two phases.
That's correct. And I'm just aware that we're talking about the patient. That's old language. And today we don't like to talk about that.
Uh-huh.
And then it went to consumer, and now we talk about the individual with a mental illness.
Right.
And I'm just old enough that it's hard for me to make the switch, but I really support that switch.
Okay. Well, from now on, we'll talk about the individual with the mental illness.
Okay.
So you have those first two phases, and then there's the third phase.
Reentry. And basically that was applying the principles to surviving in the community, but doing it extremely slowly, because what we do know is the first 3 months after an episode is the highest risk time for another episode, so that you want to create a stable period of time where they can kind of get themselves together. During that time, the other thing that is a serious problem for both the patient and the family is dealing with negative symptoms of schizophrenia. Now, the positive symptoms are the delusions, the hallucinations, the thought problems, etc. But even more difficult for families to tolerate are the negative symptoms when they become amotivated, disinterested, they sleep excessively, and that goes on sometimes for a long time. And so what we would do during that time is we'd try to keep them moving, try to keep them functioning, move towards having a social life, towards being able to work. But generally speaking, we wouldn't push on that until we had 6 months of stability. And when we had 6 months of stability, then we would get much more actively involved, what we called phase 4, of getting them out into the community.
So phase 3, reentry, was really, could be 6 months.
Could be 6 months. I can remember one case it took 2 years.
Really?
The young man just could not get past the excessive sleep. And they tried various medications because they thought he was over-medicated, but it was a period of time that he just didn't come to life. And then one day in treatment, he made a joke, and we were so thrilled because humor is one of the last things to return often. And right after that, he was able to go to voc rehab, and he started having friends again. It was time for great celebration among the team.
I've never thought about humor being one of the last things to return, but humor requires that you understand sort of the way things are and be able to twist them. And if you've not had a good grasp on what reality is,
it's hard.
You can't make that
and
twist.
Nothing seems too funny.
Right.
Now, not to say that there aren't some individuals that even throughout have a sense of humor, but it's rare. Some of them say funny things, unwittingly humorous to the rest of us, but they are not. I tell you an example. You may want to edit this out, but we were having a multiple family group because we did do that occasionally, and it was during the time John Hinckley shot President
Reagan.
And people always got very concerned about these kinds of things because it added to the stigma of mental illness and the fear people had of people who were mentally ill. One of the family members in the group said, well, yeah, what would you call John Hinckley? And one of the patients said, I'd call him a bad shot.
And I could see in the context of treatment that could be very funny. Obviously, if you're, just out in public and there's no context, it could be very offensive. But something like that really says, oh, I thought you were going to be more concrete.
Referring, was he schizophrenic or not?
So you've talked about 4 phases, or you've talked about the 3 phases. Then what happened next?
Well, throughout, even during the 3rd phase, we do very small steps. You never give up. You never stop pushing because you don't want them to sink into this negative process where they're not doing anything with their lives, because that can be very destructive in the long run too. But we ramp up the pace in the 4th phase, and we really start focusing on social contacts, which sometimes is very difficult, and being able to work or go to school. Throughout the whole process, our theme was always one change at a time. If they were working on social contacts, we wouldn't work on work. If they were managing certain family events like a wedding or whatever, which is often very upsetting, even if they're positive events, then we wouldn't initiate, social or work contacts. So there would be one change at a time. And in the 4th phase, we would do a much more focused approach to functioning.
And what would you do to focus it even more in the 4th phase?
Well, for instance, that's when we might institute vocational rehabilitation.
Okay.
They might start going to a program like that. We might give them assignments to go out and meet people, go to a drop-in center. We might help them develop certain kinds of skills. It was always focusing on what they wanted to do next. We would offer them the possibility, would you like to focus on social things? Would you like to focus on work, etc.? But we would let them make that choice. And sometimes they chose the one that was most difficult, and sometimes they chose the one, this will be a little easier for me, I'd like to start there.
So this really was acknowledging how far this person had come from the time they started the psychoeducation to, and now you're making choices about what it is you want to do that you feel would be best for your ongoing improvement.
That's right.
Okay. Now, you also mentioned that there was that you added a fifth phase.
Yes, well, we started distinguishing between 4 and 5 in a way we hadn't initially. What we said with the fifth phase was we would do family therapy about traditional family issues if they wanted it. Now you've got the person is functioning. There are other issues in the family. There might be marital issues between the parents. Very often they've coped with a lot of stress over time, and it's had a bad effect on the marriage. The person may want to move out, and there's some strain about that. So the kind of things family therapists will do. And so we would offer that. I have to say that not very many people took us up on it. People would say, this has been wonderful. This is great. I don't want to stir up anything else. Leave us alone. We'll come every 6 months and tell you how things are going. But it was a distinct phase, and there were a few that said, yeah, we really need to look at our relationships now.
So the fifth phase was really an opportunity to do what people had started to do years ago, but because they hadn't done the first 4 phases that you developed in psychoeducation, they couldn't actually get to the point where they could do family therapy effectively.
That would be my view on it. I mean, our basic assumption is not that families cause schizophrenia, and there was a long history that people believing families did cause schizophrenia, and that had to do with family communications, because you will see sometimes that the communications in these families are a little odd. But if you're living with someone who doesn't know what reality is for a long period of time, your communications might get a little odd also. So we thought that when you have that kind of stability, they have the right, as anyone else does, to try to improve relationships and improve their functioning. And so traditional family therapy was then, to us, appropriate if they wanted it. But we all have a choice of whether we want therapy. If we're functioning, we don't need therapy unless we want it.
That's right. Family psychoeducation, the way that you and your colleagues developed it, was originally a 4-stage and eventually a 5-stage process. But it was something that could last for a couple of years.
Absolutely.
So it's very different than, hi, my name's Jonathan. Thanks for coming in. Here's a pamphlet about schizophrenia. You might want to read this, and now we'll get on with our therapy.
I'd say that's quite a bit different, yes.
Quite a bit different, okay.
Well, and you have to understand that this schizophrenia is a chronic illness, and people are going to be coping with it for a long time. 20% of the people who get this disorder never have another episode, and that's terrific. But nobody can predict who those people are. You can't tell when you start out who they are. So you have to be prepared to stick with them for a while. It's only fair.
Carol, I suspect that there are social workers out there, students, maybe even educators who are listening to this podcast and thinking, well, this is a little different than what I thought psychoeducation was. It sounds like something I would want to use with the clients that are on my caseload. So how would somebody get training in psychoeducation? How would somebody be able to do these 4 or 5 stages that you talked about?
Well, specifically in our model, we wrote a book that is in essence a cookbook. It tells you exactly what to do. It tells you how to connect, how to do a workshop, how to get people back to work, how to deal with the entries. And that's still available. It's called Schizophrenia in the Family, Guilford Press. Little commercial here.
Okay. Well, we'll put a link on the website.
Okay. Most people learn to do psychoeducation through workshops. I know when I first did this, there were a ton of workshops that I did around the country and even in Asia, South America, and Europe. There are still people who are doing workshops, like Bill McFarland. I believe he's still active in that way, and some of his staff. On the SAMHSA website, there is some information about psychoeducation and how to do it and very concrete ideas about it. Unfortunately, I don't think that it's a core part of most master's programs or doctoral programs. I think it's mostly learned by people who are interested and who get excited about the ideas and get excited about the notion of having a different kind of relationship with families and patients, because it is very different and it is much more collaborative and more real. I think NAMI also probably puts out some things using the same principles. I'm not sure they would call it psychoeducation, but I think they do have people who write on this and who might also provide training. The truth of the matter is, the model is just common sense once you accept the basic principles. Once you understand that these are people who are going to be vulnerable to stimulation, and you need to find ways, even though it's not normal, for people to not be overstimulated and need to be able to manage very concrete steps. I mean, it's so social work. Particularly for social work, it's the ecological view. It's, fitting lots of things together. It offers concrete help. I mean, it's a natural. Mm-hmm. And I don't know why everyone doesn't do it if they're working with this population.
I mean, you really start where the client is.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Now, speaking of starting where the client is, I know that you developed this model working with families where there was a member with schizophrenia, but can you use psychoeducation? Conceptually, can it be used with people with different mental illnesses? And has it been studied for use with people with different mental illnesses?
It absolutely could be used for people with any illness. I would say even certain physical illnesses, chronic physical illnesses, because it would be helpful to go through this same kind of stage process. Maybe not quite as long as the way we did it. There is research and a book on doing this kind of a model with bipolar disorder, published by David Miklowitz. And you may want to put a contact to that one, too.
We'll put the link on the website, sure.
And I think there are a lot of publications about using this with various childhood disorders, attention deficit, those kinds of things. I don't know if they've done specific research, and I don't know if they've used our version of, the structure of what psychoeducation should look like, but they call it psychoeducation in many cases. And I don't think it's just handing a pamphlet, as you talked about. I think it is more involved than that. So there are all kinds of things that it could be relevant for. I'm not saying it's the aspirin for every problem in the world, but dealing with specific illnesses, be they physical or mental, I think it is a pretty good structure for how you do your treatment.
And it sounds like particularly with illnesses that have some amount of longevity.
I don't recommend it for the flu.
Right. It's pretty involved for the flu.
Yes.
Yeah. Psychoeducation is considered a family therapy. Can you talk about how it's similar to and different from some of the other traditional family therapy models, like the experiential models of Carl Whitaker, Virginia Satir, or Jay Haley's strategic family therapy?
I can talk a little bit about that. When I first started doing family therapy, which would have been about 1960, I hesitate to say this, 67 or so. I was about 12 at the time. The major models were experiential. Virginia Satir and I think Nathan Ackerman were the only books out there. What you did was you brought families into the room and you helped them to express their feelings to one another, to be more, involved in communicating with one another. And my experience at that time was that was helpful to a lot of people, but it sure wasn't helpful to people who had a psychosis in their family. It's the whole expressiveness of a lot of the models that was difficult for these kind of patients. So that's a major difference in terms of psychoeducation really not encouraging emotional expressions, not encouraging talk about very complex issues. For instance, talking about things that are intense to most of us at any time, religion, politics, our family, most difficult issues about sexuality, or all those kinds of things. They're just not a part of the whole first 4 phases of psychoeducation. And that's where a lot of family therapy is focused. The other issue with many of the family therapy models is it does assume that the family is the cause of whatever disorder or whatever symptom is being presented by, quotes, the identified patient. And so the early models, they just don't work, and they're very different. Now, structural, though, is a very short-term model. It is highly focused on specific tasks, and we did incorporate a lot of that. There isn't that much difference. And even the Bowen model focuses a lot on decreasing anxiety, and we certainly focused on that as well, although I wouldn't describe this, because we don't do a historical approach or family of origin approach, I wouldn't describe it as a Bowen model, but there are some compatibilities with that. I think that people could modify the structure of this model to include some of those other things. I just wouldn't recommend it in the early phases, because I think the most important thing is to get this person out of hospitals, functioning, and making it in the community.
Carol, you've given us a background about how psychoeducation developed, what the steps are for psychoeducation, how it's similar to and different from some existing family therapy models. And, of course, you've given some examples of what treatment looks like. I was wondering if you could tell us about maybe one family that went all the way from the first stage to the fifth in psychoeducation, and talk a little bit about what that process was like.
Sure. A case I'm thinking of is a young man who had been ill for about 7 years, who had been very seriously ill and had very few good times during those 7 years. And he was, when we picked him up, he was at the point where he was homeless, still in contact with his family, but he was homeless. He was ill-kempt. He had not brushed his teeth in 7 years or showered. Well, he might have showered sometime during that 7 years, but the teeth he hadn't touched in 7 years. And the family wanted to take him back home because they were worried about the safety of him on the streets. I mean, lots of bad things happen to these patients when they're out there. So we began focusing on small tasks, which is part of the theme of the model, small changes. We want to build in experiences of success. So the first task we gave as a homework task was that sometime between the session that we were in and the next session we were going to have, that he would brush his teeth once.
Really? So how did you come up with that task?
Well, that task was because he was going back home and his family found it very difficult to have this ill-kempt, smelly person around. And, they were concerned about that. But, it was something doable also. It was something that we could take on and we thought we could get some success in. Because we wanted to build confidence. And you don't start with anything that, not the most crucial issues like his psychotic thoughts, but the issues that you can start getting the person prepared to be a participating member of the family and of the community.
So this was after you had done the first stage and the
workshop.
And the workshop and the second stage. So this is the third stage.
Right.
And the family came to you and said, we want him home, we care about him, but we got to be honest, it's a little distressing and disturbing to us how badly he smells and his teeth. And so you said, okay, well, this is something that he could probably be successful at. And so that was the first task.
That was the first task, and he did it. And that gradually, one task built upon another until he was looking more socially acceptable. And in the meantime, the family's feeling better about him. There's less pressure. They're doing less to intrude upon him. They're letting it be up to him. And he reports to us in the sessions, etc. And then gradually we built on him going out of the house more and having some kind of social contacts. We're talking over, months and months of him getting to the point where he felt comfortable going out, getting to the point of having relationships, sometimes with other patients, but then gradually with extended family and other people in the community. Eventually, he first got a job sweeping floors in a restaurant. There's an art to getting people who are bright, aside from their mental illness, to see that it's relevant to have a job like that. But the way we present those kinds of things is you need to get used to having a job, to having responsibilities, to getting up in the morning, etc. And so we're building skills that will get you to the kind of job or life you would like to have. So eventually he got a better job. Eventually he went to community college and graduated from community college, got a girlfriend. And at that point, things were stable for so long that we offered the family the opportunity to talk about other issues. And the parents chose that time to say, we'd like to work on our relationship without him because we've spent so many years just staying on top of this whole problem of mental illness that we don't even know each other anymore. And so they started talking about their relationship and getting reacquainted. We assigned them going out on dates and all, and they did that. And it was a wonderful experience for us to see it could get that far, too, because not everybody chose to go the family route at the end.
And so the parents working on their own issues, this was the fifth phase that you're talking about that most families did not take you up on. Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
So it was a wonderful success case, and I think that not all of them were able to go to college. I mean, obviously, there are patients that don't do that well, and there are patients who are always going to be a little odd or off by themselves. But many of them, as we know from other people's research and long-term 20-year follow-ups on this disorder, you would not know that they had ever had a mental illness. So it does tend to get better over time if you can prevent the de-skilling and the negative effects of hospitalization long-term.
Well, Carol, thanks so much for spending the time to talk to us today about family psychoeducation. It was a pleasure for me.
I enjoyed it too, actually.
All right, great. Thanks so much.
Bye.
So, I'm Jonathan Singer. Thanks for being with me today for this episode of the Social Work Podcast. If you missed an episode, visit our website at socialworkpodcast.com. If you have suggestions for future podcasts, please email me at jonathan@socialworkpodcast.com. And to all the social workers out there, keep up the good work. We'll see you back here next time at the Social Work Podcast.